Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
And our goal is to break down for you how government works so you can make the government work for you. Bobbi, we're continuing our conversation today about the Constitution and a lot of work that went into that. But first, we're going to do the Fast Five. The Fast Five.
And it's my turn to ask you questions this time. So, number one, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
What is your favorite type of music?
Well, this will shock you. Broadway. We were just talking Broadway.
That's right, we were.
You've been to one Broadway show, Jesus Christ Superstar. I saw Cabaret with Molly Ringwald, and it was on Broadway in Studio 54. They had converted it. It was so cool.
Number two, what's your favorite type of cuisine?
Italian, I think. I could eat Italian anything.
I'm telling you, those meatballs the other night looked fabulous.
Yeah, we'll make some sometime.
Number three, if you could have any superpower, what would it be and why?
You know, this is such a clever question. I'm glad you asked it, and I didn't decide my answer until we're at the Logansport Cass County Public Library. We shout that out today. So we're in Logansport, and I'm driving from Westfield, and I look up, and I saw a billboard from Dolly Parton, and it said on it, "Find the good in everybody." So I think that if I could have a superpower, it would be to be able to broker peace with anybody, because it's become so easy for us to find things that are different and make that a bad thing.
That's good.
That's a weird superpower, but that probably won't be a movie about it. But yeah.
We need that. Number four, what is a piece of advice you would give your younger self?
The sky's the limit. I limited myself so much by my education levels, by my town I was brought up in. I never thought I would do this big thing, and I think if I would have grabbed for stars that I might be where I'm going to be when you ask your next question.
You should have followed the advice. Grab the brass ring, right?
Exactly.
You see it when you come into Logansport.
Yeah, you're right.
And five, what is your dream job?
So this goes to, I wish I would have grabbed the brass ring. Look, I'm happy with where I am in my career. I've done some wonderful things. I anchored the morning news at the biggest news talk station in the Midwest for years, but I always wanted to be a network news anchor on TV. And if I would have pushed myself, I know I've got the talent to do it.
Definitely.
But that's my dream
Things
job.
happen, but I could. You have a great voice for that.
Well, thank you. I would have been in heaven doing that. So there are the Fast Five questions for this week, and we're going back to, I'm not sure how many parts we've had for the Constitution, but it's taken several.
Yeah.
So we're going back. This is episode 10 today, Bobbi, so let's get to work.
This is the fourth. I just looked back, fourth episode. So, but we're going to pretty much wrap the main part of it up today, and then I'm going to pick some little bits and pieces out that I feel like people will need more explanation for. Let's put it that way.
I was complimenting you off mic too, because so much of what we're talking about in here, some of these terms we're going to hear today, some of the terms you heard during the last episode, references to the Constitution, are things we're hearing on the news every day these days.
And now our feature presentation.
So we left off in episode 9 with, it was July 16th, 1787, with the passing of the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. Get this, 5-4 to 1 vote. So it was close.
Who abstained?
Yeah, I don't have those details, but it did pass by 1 vote. And this settled the equal versus proportional representation debate, which was the biggie. And it worked out some other details related to representation, such as the census and counting 3/5 of slaves toward the population counts. It did solve the one, I would say, huge sticking point that they were caught on in the Constitutional Convention. Had they not settled it, I'm not sure where we'd be today, really. Starting the day after, on July 17th, the delegates were now faced with discussing and debating some other things that were going to be important, such as powers of the legislative branch or Congress, treaties and how they would be done, where they would originate, and the executive branch. Some issues that they debated about the executive were whether the executive would be appointed or elected, the requirements of the person elected, such as their age, were there going to be any eligibility requirements, their powers, impeachment of such a person, and their term of office. Also, there were some details of the judiciary that were discussed and debated during this time as well. And they do eventually settle. Article 3 in the Constitution is about the judiciary, but they left that. That's actually a very short part when we look at the first 3 articles of the Constitution, because they left it open for Congress to come back to that later on, which they do early on after the Constitution is agreed upon. They kind of just lay out a really brief framework for the judiciary. So by July 23rd, discussion of oaths and the process for ratification of the new Constitution were discussed, as well as the things I previously mentioned. So another committee was created called the Committee of Detail. It was tasked with drafting the first version of the U.S. Constitution. 5 delegates were appointed on July 24th, 1787, and their job was to translate the agreed-upon resolutions that we've talked about that were debated since the beginning of the convention in May up until the end of July. They had to translate all these resolutions into the single document. And their report they presented on August 6th, 1787. It became the foundation for the Constitution that we have today. At this point, July 25th, 1787, there are 4 different proposals for the process of electing the executive or president. In late August 1787, the Committee of Detail for the convention selected members for another committee that's known as the Brearley Committee, whose objective was to settle outstanding issues, with the main issue being the presidential clause. So this separate committee is going to look at all of these 4 different proposals for the executive or president. Now, those 4 proposals that they had to deal with were for the election of president, consider election by part of the legislature. So that's one option that had been thrown out. Hamilton proposed that there just be an executive chosen for life.
Which, wait a minute, that blew my mind when I was going through your notes. It's like, wait a minute, we want a king sort of like figure again?
We can tell where that's
that didn't happen.
Option 3, election by state executives. So members of state governments would elect the executive. And finally, the idea of what becomes known as the Electoral College method, which is what is ultimately selected and still in use today. And I'm not going to explain the Electoral College right now. That's going to be one of our... But many experts today, including yours truly, believe the Electoral College is outdated and ineffective. And we will discuss it in more detail later, because most people don't understand
at all
how it works, why it was ultimately chosen for this. I touch on that shortly, but we'll talk more in detail about the Electoral College later. So on September 4th, the Brearley Committee recommended that the convention support the Electoral College method of choosing a president. They did agree that there would be a 4-year renewable term and that the president must be a natural-born citizen. They also agreed on things such as a president could be impeached for, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, the Electoral College meant to them that both the people and the states would be represented in the election of the president. And as I said, we're going to take on the Electoral College separately at a later time. I will just say right now that one of the reasons it was chosen to do it this way is that the framers felt that there weren't enough, I hate using this terminology, but people, regular people in the states were not informed enough, not necessarily educated enough, although that I'm sure was part of it, because they were, as we said in the first episode of this, very educated, but that they weren't informed enough either to make a decision on who should be this top chief executive of our country. That's why they didn't think just using a popular vote method for the election of this executive was the right way to go, because of the lack of informed information that everyday people had. Back to the convention. On August 6, 1787, the convention received the report from the Committee of Detail and adjourned to read the 23 articles from their draft. On August 7th, discussion of the report began and continued through August 31st. Some of these discussions, and again, this is not a complete list, these are just some things that I thought people need to understand. That this was a huge process. Yeah. Lots of details that they had to work out. They discussed the preamble and what would be in it, details of requirements for members of both the House of Representatives and the Senate, or the lower and upper house, as it was called called before. What age should somebody be? What should their citizenship status be? And of course, what would the duties and responsibilities of members of the House and the Senate be? The enumeration, which it means list of congressional powers, presidential cabinet or advisors to the president, definition of treason, the necessary and proper clause, which we'll come back to those next episode to talk about what those mean in more detail. Also, the no interference with the slave trade becomes another one of the slave issues that they deal with. Taxes and trade, executive and judicial powers, and here's another one that we hear sometimes today, writ of habeas corpus, limits on state powers, the fugitive slave clause, so there's slavery again, admission of new states, a guarantee that this would be a Republican form of government, the amending process, oaths of allegiance, mode of ratification or approval of the new Constitution, and finally, authorization of the new Constitution by the Confederation Congress. Remember, they're still the one.
In business.
They're still in business, yes. And then how they would transition from the Confederation Congress and government to the new one, should all this finally be accepted. On September 1st, the Braley Committee report on the election of the president was heard. Parts of this report and the Committee of Details report continued to be discussed and debated up through September 17th, 1787, with completed portions submitted to the Committee of Style as each debate and revision was completed. And again, I'll stop there for a moment. If you want to see the nitty-gritty details of all that, it'll be in the link that I'll post once this episode goes up. If you want to know who voted for what, you can see that on the website.
I think it's great that people would want to know that. We like those kind of nerdy people.
Exactly.
You're in the right group if you want to know those details.
And I'd put all that in here, but we'd be on here for hours.
Yeah.
Okay, so on September 12th, Elbridge Gerry and George Mason, Gerry again was from Massachusetts, George Mason was one of the other Virginia delegates, they called for a Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution, but that motion was defeated. Once all of the discussion, debates, and revisions were completed on Monday, September 17th, 1787, the Constitution was signed. Every year, if you look at your calendars, on September 17th, that is Constitution Day.
Yeah.
And it's called that because this is the day that they finalized everything and put their signatures on it. Now, it's not been approved by the states yet or anything. This is just when the final product that eventually becomes our Constitution that we have now. So this ended almost 5 months of work by the delegates at the convention and created the framework of government that now consists, and what they turned in, consists of 7 articles. And articles are just the name that they use for each part of the Constitution. So we have Article 1, which is by far the longest of the 7 articles, and that's because it details the legislative branch of our government, which is Congress.
When we hear Congress, Bobbi, Congress is the Senate and the House.
That's correct. So remember we talked about it called for a bicameral legislature. So we have the lower house is the House of Representatives, the upper house is the Senate. So all of the details, their requirements to be a member of the House or a member of the Senate, what all their duties are.
Length of terms.
Length of term, the enumeration of the powers of Congress. So all that is spelled out in detail. So that's why this is such a lengthy article. They've got to cover both houses and they've got to cover what all their duties are. So it is lengthy. Next is Article 2, which details the executive branch, which is president. And it's not extremely long. It details, again, the requirements for being president.
Is age 35?
35 and a natural-born citizen. Initially, there was no limit on terms, but later an amendment is added in the 1950s to limit the president to 2 terms.
And because when we look back on it, FDR served more than 2 terms.
He was elected to 4, but he did not get to serve out his 4th.
He died quickly.
Yeah, he died.
Yeah.
Up to that point, nobody had served more than 2 terms, and they kind of did that because they looked back at Washington and saw that he had power for a short time, and the feeling early on was that, we don't want a king. We don't want somebody that's there for life or whatever, and so they kind of honored that this is a temporary position.
I wish for for Article 1, they would have put more thought to term limits, but I wasn't there.
Well, it could still be added today with an amendment, but that's a difficult task. Also, Article 2 does call out for a cabinet. Originally, there were only 3 cabinet positions. Today, we have 17 cabinet positions, so that has changed. Article 3 set out the judicial branch, and all it really specifically says is that there would be a Supreme Court and other inferior courts. That becomes one of the first works of Congress when this Constitution is put into place. And one of their first things is to do the Judiciary Act of 1789, which further details the judicial system.
It's interesting to me that we did do limits to our executive. However, there are some courts in which you serve basically for the rest of your life, and there's not an end of term.
Federal courts, the Supreme Court, their position is for life. And again, as you said, that's been more discussion about that lately as to whether that maybe needs to be looked at. And then we have Article 4, which establishes the relationship between the federal government and the states. So this is where this idea of a federal system where powers are divided. So our federal or national government has specific powers set out in the Constitution, and then the states also have certain powers. And the way I think of it is the states, more of their powers have to do with things that affect us more on a daily basis or a personal basis. Like states are in charge of like marriage laws and divorce laws and driving, to get a driver's license. Those are not things that our federal or national government deals with. And then we have Article 5, which established the amendment process. So how can changes be made to the Constitution, which if you think about it, it's amazing that they thought of that that things would change and that maybe this wouldn't be a perfect document and that things would need to be tweaked or added or taken away in some future moment.
It is the great experiment.
It is. Article 6 is known as the Supremacy Clause because it specifically establishes that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It is above state law, local law, any laws, supreme law. And then finally, Article 7 laid out the ratification process. It's called the Ratification Clause, which stated once 9 of the 13 states had ratified the Constitution, it would take effect. I think they were kind of looking at the Articles of Confederation and thinking, we don't want this to be like all of them. Once we get more than a majority, this is going to take effect. And that alone is going to take a while to accomplish.
Yeah, I got the ball rolling. These guys, their brains were brilliant. The things that they saw that could possibly happen, that they were just thinking, what if? They had the what if break the glass scenarios. So we look at these framers and miracle minds.
And this is signing day. This is September 17th. Now, 3 important members who had been there for everything, George Mason of Virginia, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, I already mentioned those two, and Edmund Randolph, also a Virginia delegate, refused to sign the final product because they objected that there was no Bill of Rights to protect personal rights. Remember, that was a large part of the Declaration of Independence. It was protecting our rights. And they also had some concerns about the power given to the central or the national government. And we're going to talk about a Bill of Rights. Madison wanted a Bill of Rights, but he does sign. And that's going to be an issue that we'll look at down the road here that, we do obviously eventually get a Bill of Rights, but it's not until 1791. So 4 years after the signing of the Constitution.
I felt like the Bill of Rights sometimes gets confused to, I think there are some folks, I could have been among them before I started this podcast, you think of the Declaration of Independence and you think that's part of the Constitution, but all of these get convoluted.
Exactly.
But so eventually we do get our Bill of Rights.
It's complicated.
Yeah,
that's why we're doing this. It is complicated. There were some others who didn't sign the Constitution for various reasons. Some had left early. There were a couple that illness set in and they weren't able to be there. A couple others had issues with some other parts. We started with 55. We still have more than a majority of the original members that are there. So Ben Franklin gets up and gives a speech, which today is known as the Rising Sun speech. And it's called that because the chair that George Washington sat in Independence Hall, and of course things back then were made out of wood, and it had this sun carved into the top of the chair back. And it even had some color in it and to make it so you could tell it was a sun. sun. Nobody knows, was it really a rising sun
Right.
or was it a setting
How
sun?
do
And
you
there's
tell?
been debate about that. So the following remarks were recorded by James Madison at the close of the Constitutional Convention. Whilst the last members were signing it, meaning the Constitution, Dr. Franklin, looking towards the president's chair at the back of which a rising sun happened to be painted, observed to a few members near him that painters had found it difficult to distinguish in their art a rising from a setting sun. I have said he often, and often in the course of the session, and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun.
Powerful quote and great for this fledgling country.
Exactly. It's like, let's look at it positively. This is a new beginning. So it's like the sun coming up again.
That gave me chills. I like that kind of color that
Right.
you add to these episodes.
I will add, if you go to Independence Hall, the chair, you can see the,
Still there?
the chair with the sun.
Right, the
on
chair
it.
with the rising sun.
That's right.
Sounds like a song.
That ends the main part of the convention. In the next episode, I think we're going to go back and look at some of these loose ends that would take too much time to explain in the process, but things like the ratification process and the slavery issue, because I mentioned, we had the 3/5 clause, we had the fugitive slave clause. There was the slave trade was the other thing that the Constitution mentions. So we'll look at those in detail. The Electoral College
Oh, God.
and the lack of the Bill of Rights. Now, we're not going to talk about the Bill of Rights yet because, as I said, it takes a while, but we're going to look at that. I would say it was a controversy, the fact that there was no Bill of Rights in this. It did prevent a couple
Voters.
gentlemen from signing, and it is something that we're going to end up getting. It just wasn't done at this original process.
Hopefully, as folks listen to the podcast, they'll realize how important some of these things we take for granted are to us and our individual rights.
Right. A couple other things, too. I know necessary and proper clause we'll take a look at, and writ of habeas corpus, especially since we've heard that in the news.
I'm interested in that one because I hear it.
And really the only other time that the writ of habeas corpus is ever mentioned a lot is around the time of the Civil War, when Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus. So people have probably heard it even before now, but don't really understand what it is.
Very good. So that wraps up this episode's topic, but it is time for the pop quiz.
Bueller.
Okay, last episode, the question was, this was an easy one, hopefully. How many amendments does the Constitution have today?
It was not an easy one, I don't think. I think it was a hard one, and I think only because I rub elbows with the right people did I know it was 27.
It is 27. So we had the original Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments, but they were added all at the same time. And then since then, we've only had 17 changes. Think about that. Since 1791, we've only had, after the Bill of Rights, 17 times that they've had to change or make an addition to.
Yeah,
our
one in
Constitution.
Prohibition was the 180.
Yeah.
The 360.
So you can kind of put those two together,
Let's count as
because
one.
they did
Yeah.
the one and then they had to take it away.
I love it. So next question.
Yeah, this week's question from the naturalization test is name one branch or part of the U.S. government. And I just mentioned them, and
You're listening.
So you should be able to come up with these.
Very good.
So name one branch of the U.S. government.
All right, so we've tied up some loose ends, and we still have a few more to tie up on the next podcast. And once we get those tied up, I'm picking your brain. Where do you think we're headed?
I think episode 12 is where we're going to break down the preamble.
Okay, which is a project you had your kids do in
I
school.
used to do it with my 8th graders. A lot of people know at least some of the words of the preamble, at least the we the people part.
Right, hopefully.
But some know more than that. I think a lot of people never really stop and look. It kind of gets left out. Nobody looks at what were they really saying in the preamble.
I'd love to get some of your students that you had over the years as a guest to join us on the podcast. someday, because you were big into that with your DC trips and your kids. So we've got the right person here doing all this. Thank you for all your homework that you did for us. I know that you put a lot into these last 2 episodes. So Bobbi, thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right, that's it for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics. No politics, just facts. Thanks for listening. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works so you can make the government work for you.